Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a look at a really interesting set of sources. They explore music, emotion, and faith, especially in, well, certain conservative religious contexts.
That's right. And, while this often gets talked about as just disagreements over music styles, the whole worship wars thing, these sources argue it's actually pointing to something much, much deeper.
Deeper issues, like what?
Well, issues around authenticity, how we express ourselves, our ability to genuinely connect, both, inside faith communities and maybe with the wider world, too.
Okay. So our mission for this deep dive is really to get past those surface arguments. We want to look at where this tension comes from, understand what these sources say about music and emotion's real relationship.
And see what the material, particularly scripture, actually tells us about, well, embracing the whole range of human feelings in our faith.
Right. Sounds like we'll be challenging some common assumptions.
Definitely. And looking at how this stuff impacts not just, say, a Sunday service, but your own personal faith walk and how you relate to others, even people who, see things very differently.
Okay, let's dig in. So the sources start by kind of setting the stage. They describe this common view, often found in more conservative settings, about music and emotion.
Yeah, it's this idea that certain kinds of music, often stuff from outside Anglo culture, the sources note produce carnal or negative emotions, anger, anxiety, confusion, a sensuality even.
And the flip side is?
The flip side is that other music, often linked to what the sources call high-class Anglo culture, is seen as inherently sacred. It supposedly produces only holy or proper feelings.
The sources use that biblical example, right? Moses and Joshua coming down from Sinai.
Exactly. After the golden calf thing, they hear noise. Joshua thinks it's war. Moses says, no, it's singing. But it's singing linked to idolatry, something really negative.
So that link, certain music equals negative or unholy emotion.
Yeah, the sources say that specific connection often underpins these sort of subconscious biases, those quick snap judgments people make about music styles.
Right. But then the sources immediately push back on this. They get into something really fundamental about music itself. They basically say music is language, not math.
Precisely. The core argument is that music's whole point is emotional connection. It works like a metaphorical language, you see. It's not something you can just easily intellectualize or, well, they use this great word, mathify.
Mathify, I like that. It sums up trying to use hard science like brain scans or hormone levels.
Yeah, applying quantifiable measures.
To pin down something as subjective as how music makes you feel.
And there's a crucial philosophical point the source makes. You can't get an ought, a moral judgment, good or bad, from an is, just observing a physical reaction, like brain activity.
It's just too simplistic.
Way too simplistic. And they even point out that the bits of music that seem mathematical, like scales and stuff, even those are culturally relative. Different cultures carve up the octave differently.
So even the mathy parts show it's more like a language with different dialects.
Yeah, than some kind of universal science.
Exactly. Okay, now this next part, this is where it gets really personal, I think.
Yeah.
The sources stress how your own background, your assumptions, personality, genetics, even your past experiences.
Yeah, all of that profoundly shapes how you respond emotionally to music. It's not just inherent in the sound waves.
This really makes sense. They use that powerful analogy, right, about hearing screaming in music.
Oh, yeah. When you hear screaming, are you hearing someone scream at you? Or maybe screaming with you? Or even for you, voicing something you feel.
And how you interpret that depends entirely on whether you can identify with the performer.
And, maybe more importantly, how comfortable you are with your own emotions, like anger, for instance.
And they give those really concrete examples, like a song that just triggers bad memories for you.
Right, maybe linked to a time you regret.
That-
The song isn't inherently bad, but your personal history attaches this negative feeling to it.
Or that story about the suit, how just seeing a certain type of suit could trigger this really negative response for someone because of past church experiences.
Yeah, painful associations. The suit itself is neutral, but the emotional trigger is totally tied to past events.
So these examples really show the layers involved.
Yeah.
You can't make these simple is to ought moral judgments based on how someone reacts emotionally.
Absolutely not. And the sources also mention external stuff, like knowing about an artist's actions. The As I Lay Dying example, knowing what the singer did can completely change how you hear the music, right?
Okay.
It overrides the purely musical response.
So the sources are pretty blunt, trying to oversimplify this whole dynamic between the music, the emotion, the listener.
Mm-hmm.
It's just irresponsible.
Irresponsible. Okay, so moving on, there's another big frustration the sources tackle. It's this tendency, especially in what they define of Anglo-cultural spheres, to basically moralize one specific cultural expression.
Eurocentric high culture, essentially, making that the gold standard for what's sacred or moral.
Exactly. And they're careful to say it's not about race or skin color per se, but about a certain way of being, somber, stiff, non-emotive, stoic.
They contrast that with the preacher at Meghan and Harry's wedding.
Perfect example. His very emotional, passionate style versus the much more reserved demeanor of many European guests. The source suggests some cultural lenses saw one as inherently more proper or even moral.
And this cultural filter, this Eurocentric lens,
Yeah.
it ends up pushing away a whole chunk of human emotions, doesn't it?
It really does. Things like anger, frustration, deep sadness, despair. They get labeled as somehow inappropriate for faith or for sacred spaces.
And that then shapes what gets defined as sacred music. Only stuff that fits that restrained high culture mold.
Yeah, it reinforces that earlier idea. Only certain styles are deemed holy enough.
But then the sources make this powerful shift. They challenge that whole filter by going straight to Scripture. And they argue the Bible, well, it does the opposite. It embraces the full range of human emotion.
Right, including the ugly, the messy, the really intense stuff.
And they pull out some pretty strong examples.
Oh, yeah. David in the Psalms, he's not just writing praise songs. He's asking God to, completely obliterate his enemies. Even that horrifying line in Psalm 137 about dashing babies against rocks.
Wow. Yeah, intense is putting it mildly. Or think about Lamentations, Jeremiah. Just raw despair, protest, real anguish.
And Jesus himself, the sources point to him flipping tables in the temple, expressing clear anger. They really push back on cleaning that up, making it seem less disruptive. They say, look, you can't avoid the image of Jesus with a whip driving people out.
So given all that biblical reality, the sources ask this tough question. If you take a verse like Philippians 4:8, whatever is true, noble, pure, and apply it simplistically.
How much of the Bible itself would you have to cut out? Because it's full of ugliness, messiness, violence, disturbing things.
Yeah. And they also highlight lament, protest. These aren't fringe elements in the Bible.
No, they're central, especially in the prophets and Psalms. They contrast a perceived Western focus on thankfulness and celebration with how, maybe in Eastern or Global South contexts, lament is often vital for survival. They use Habakkuk complaining boldly to God as a key example of this biblical tradition.
Okay, so connecting these ideas, the sources are basically saying that if you suppress this full emotional spectrum, whether as an individual or as a community,
You end up with communities that are, fundamentally inauthentic.
it's that Sabbath face idea, right? Putting on a brave face, pretending everything's fine when it isn't.
Exactly, because you feel those messier feelings aren't welcome or appropriate there.
And this lack of authenticity, the sources argue, is a huge hurdle for mission, especially today when people really value genuineness.
Yeah, people see the walls, they sense the fakeness, like that story about the wife whose non-church friends felt more real with her than some people at church.
Okay, so then the sources take that critique about emotional manipulation in some modern worship, and they turn it around.
They do. They argue that traditional elements, stained glass, big architecture, dressing up, hushed tones, the specific mood of some hymns, those also push emotional buttons.
They're also designed to create a feeling, potentially a false sense of reverence or sacredness.
They're just as much about eliciting an emotional response as maybe, a smoke machine or stage lights in a different setting.
And they make that really powerful comparison with Old Testament sacrifice.
Whoa, yeah. God was clearly okay with some intense sensory and emotional stuff back then. Slitting animal throats, blood everywhere.
Right, so the sources ask, which is really more extreme, a smoke machine or that?
It's a provocative question. And another surprising point they make. Those music genres often called satanic rock, rap, metal, which often come from places of protesting injustice.
They might actually capture the Bible's full, messy, angry, combative, emotional range better sometimes than the music we usually call sacred.
Yeah, they use Psalm 3 as an example. A gospel choir version leaves out the line about God smashing enemies' teeth.
But a Christian metal band includes it.
And the sources suggest the metal band, in that case, is actually being more faithful to the emotion in the text. It's like that idea of the rocks crying out. Sometimes music outside the church walls expresses things the church is suppressing.
So let's bring this back to you, the listener. The sources argue denying your full emotional self is bad for community, but also bad for you personally.
Yeah, they call it compartmentalized spirituality. You wall off parts of yourself, sadness, anger, maybe even intense joy or sexuality from God. You treat them as somehow unholy or off limits in your spiritual life.
And they flip that common idea that listening to certain music means you haven't surrendered everything.
Right. They argue the opposite almost. If you don't engage with your full humanity, your anger, your pain, your sexuality, you might not even know those parts of you well enough to surrender them to God.
So, practically speaking then, if a church wants to embrace this fuller spectrum, how do they do it? What do the sources suggest?
Well, they offer some practical ideas. Things like incorporating corporate readings of Psalms, the raw ones too. Maybe responsive readings, scripture memorization that includes the tough stuff.
They mention N.T. Wright's point about lament.
Yeah.
Right. Especially after something like the pandemic.
Yeah, that the church needs to relearn lament to have a credible witness, to show it understands suffering.
But the ultimate point isn't necessarily just changing the music style.
No, not necessarily. They admit some churches might stick with hymns for various reasons. The key change, they argue, is about mindset, our approach to culture, diversity, and, well, the whole messy range of human emotion within our faith.
So this shift in thinking, fueled by engaging with the whole Bible.
That's what fosters real, authentic relationships. It lets us connect genuinely with people different from us, which they see as vital for mission today.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive really suggests Scripture itself kind of frees us from these narrow, culturally bound ideas about emotion and faith.
Yeah, it invites us to embrace the whole complex, sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately essential and beautiful spectrum of being human before God.
And maybe a final thought for you to consider. Just take a moment to think about your own faith journey. Which emotions might you have learned, maybe subtly, maybe not so subtly, were unholy or inappropriate? What might happen if you started to embrace those parts of yourself, engaging with that full spectrum like the Bible often does? How could that actually deepen your connection, both with God and with the people around you?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.